Yeah, so it's an interesting approach to structure content so that you're hopefully trying to go off and encourage the organizations to push themselves to better understand their users and be able to build a website that meets the needs of their users.
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Chris Adams. Hello, and welcome to the Green Software Foundation podcast, Environment Variables, where we bring you the latest news and updates from the world of sustainable software development. I'm your host, Chris Adams. When we look at the drivers adopting digital sustainability in industry, as much as we want to think people will build green and digital services out of the goodness of their own hearts, it's worth bearing in mind that in a commercial environment, other concerns frequently take precedence. And if we want to see wider adoption of more sustainable practices in digital, a lot of the time we have to be somewhat strategic, learning from other fields, for example, and being thoughtful about how we spend the social and political capital we might have available to us. So where should we be looking for people who've done this before? One commonly cited field is the field of accessibility and inclusive design, where over the last 20 years, we've seen accessibility move from a field where lone, heroic actions were the norm to one where, in growing parts of the world, accessibility is a non-negotiable, mandatory requirement in new projects with the full force of the law behind it now. So, are there wins from the accessibility movement that we can learn from to apply for digital sustainability? And where in the history of accessibility online should we be looking? With us today, we have Mike Gifford, an accessibility and open web veteran, to help us navigate these questions. Mike, thanks very much for joining. Can I give you the floor to introduce yourself today?
Absolutely. I'm Mike Gifford. I'm a senior strategist at Civic Actions. I'm excited to be here. I'm definitely an active listener, and I've really enjoyed all the discussions that have taken place from other leaders in this field. I'm also a Drupal core accessibility maintainer. Drupal runs about 1 million websites around the world, and I've been trying to improve accessibility in that field and increasingly trying to do work in sustainability there as well. At Civic Actions, I lead the accessibility practice area. I've also been involved in contributing to the WC3's Sustainable Web Community Group's draft web sustainability guidelines. That's a bit of a mouthful, but it's essentially just a group of people within a standards body called the WC3 that is trying to go off and create a set of best practices around sustainability. And I've also spearheaded the development of a tool called OpenACR, which is a new way to try and help organize vendor claims around digital accessibility.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And for folks who are listening to this for the first time, we do have a podcast episode specifically with the W3C, some of the other members. We'll link to that in the show notes. If you're new to this podcast, my name is Chris Adams, as I mentioned before. I work at the Green Web Foundation, where we are a Dutch nonprofit focused on reaching an entirely fossil-free internet by 2030. I also am one of the chairs of the Green Software Foundation's Policy Working Group and one of the maintainers of a software library called CO2JS, which you can probably guess what that does from the name. It makes it easy to work out the environmental impact of various digital services. Mike, before we start, I should ask, because when I have spoken to you before, I've generally assumed you're in Canada, but you mentioned you might not be. So first of all, where are you calling from and how's the weather?
So I'm calling from outside of Carcassonne, France, and I've been here for just over 5 months, and I've got another 4 months to go. My wife wanted to have a sabbatical between careers, and this was a good place for us to learn French and eat cheese, and stumble across castles, and explore the culture of Europe. So that's why we're here. And the weather here generally has been really good, especially compared to Ottawa. But right now, it really has. It's been a cold, nasty week this week, and so it's not been very good. And it'll actually be warmer in Ottawa later this week than it is here in outside of Carcassonne. So it's a lot of climate chaos is going on around the world, and we're seeing it all over the place. It's inconsistent weather.
Wow, I did not realize that. I generally would assume that Ottawa and Carcassonne, I mean, they're more or less the same latitude, right? But they are definitely not the same temperature most of the time. And Ottawa's definitely colder normally, right?
Yes, absolutely. We can get down to -20, -30 Celsius in the winter. And in the summer, we can get up to, plus 30, sometimes 35 Celsius, but it's definitely gets much colder. It has a much heavier impact from the Arctic weather.
Wow. So I guess thank you, Jetstream, for the clement weather in Western Europe. Okay.
Yes.
Long may it stay, I suppose. Yeah. All right. So I think you're sitting comfortably. For folks who are listening, we have a show notes. So we're going to mention various projects and we'll do our best to list every single project and website that we do. So if you are listening along and you want to learn more about one of the things we have, please do check out the show notes at podcast.greensoftware.foundation for more. All right then, Mike, sitting comfortably, I guess, should we start? Yeah. Okay, so I did this introduction talking a little bit about accessibility, but I didn't do a particularly good job of explaining what accessibility might be. And I'm wondering, before we talk about sustainability, maybe you could just expand a little bit about what people tend to mean when they talk about accessibility in this context, because I think there are a few misconceptions that people tend to bring when they first hear about accessibility. What is accessibility, and what are the kind of myths that we might want to think about that we should probably dispel?
First of all, people assume that accessibility is just for the blind and deaf community. Like, this is who we're trying to go off and to meet. And there's a small number of people who comply with that. Why do we need to really worry with this? This is just a government overreach and additional administration. But that's actually not the case. If you look at permanent disabilities, most countries in the Western world, a quarter of the population has some form of disability. So that could be, and that's a permanent disability. So that could be somebody who's got low vision or no vision, people who have hearing problems, mobility problems, could be cognitive problems, people who have dyslexia, color blindness. It's a whole range of different aspects. And I tend to think of it like just part of the human experience. Is it that when we're born, we have certain limitations and we grow up and we learn how to do things and we have abilities that we have at this time, but they change over time. When I have allergies, my eyesight isn't as good because I have blurry eyes because I've got allergies. There's also situations where as we age, like as soon as you're over 40, your eyesight begins to degrade. Probably most people listening to this podcast have glasses. That's a form of assistive technology. If you didn't have glasses, you probably would have much more difficulty reading a book or reading a monitor or your phone for that matter. There's also issues of temporary and situational disabilities. So if you're injured, for example, or you're carrying a baby or you're in a loud environment, it may be more difficult for you to go off and to hear the other information that's going on around you. The other thing is looking at people who might be in a place where there isn't a lot of internet, or if you're using an older device. These are also places where there's limited elements people can access. And if you're in rural Canada, you can have a lot of difficulty going off and getting a bandwidth, go off and to download a web page. And that's not a disability as such, but it is a way that is people are being disabled because the assumption is that people who are using the technology are going to have super fast bandwidth.
Infinite bandwidth, newest iPhone, everything like that.
If you don't have the latest device and the highest bandwidth, then you're going to have a lot of challenges. And so many people outside of urban areas don't. And even inside of urban areas, there's places where there's dead zones in cities or the things are wrong or inconsistent. So a lot of our assumptions are incorrect. And I like to think about it also in terms of just ultimately, the planet is going to be fine. With or without us, the planet will survive. It comes down to us as a species. And as a species, as Western civilization, how do we want to organize ourselves to survive? And the brass tacks is that we have to work on a very fragile planet, and we have to work with the fact that we are fragile species, and that we need to go off and think about not us at the height of our abilities, but looking at human abilities throughout the whole gambit of our lives, right? Hopefully we'll all grow old. Hopefully we'll all be able to explore and experience worlds where we do have different abilities because we've managed to live to 80, 90, 100 years old. But that will be a different experience for all of us.
I see. Okay. All right. That's actually quite an expansive and interesting way of framing it. I haven't actually thought about it in that way. And the idea of saying, well, accessibility is actually a kind of, the fact that you've shifted it somewhat to the situation you're in is actually something that I think that's quite helpful framing. Okay. So we've got a rough idea that accessibility isn't just about helping a small number of blind people. It's actually a significant part of the population, in many cases, probably larger than 25% when you include the different situational aspects one might actually be in. Okay. And it sounds like, did you ever see the London Olympics opening where they've got Tim Berners-Lee or like Tim Ball to his friends saying, where he has this whole thing like, this is for everyone. He's talking about the web and the internet. There's a thing that it seems very much that you're kind of, there's a reference to that, I suppose. So these sound like good things, right? But we know that historically, when people are working on digital projects, accessibility hasn't had the same kind of priority that, say, shipping a new feature might be, or making sure a particular date is hit by a team working on something. So let's say that as society, the things you've described sound like good things to be aiming for and wanting to include. How has maybe the accessibility community made sure these do get prioritized? Because they don't immediately all sound like they would have an immediate short-term kind of benefit, for example, or that you might explain to on an earnings call, for example. Maybe you could, say, lay some of that out there and we can explore some of that area as well.
You think that it really wouldn't take much more of a carrot than trying to go off and support your future self, because that's ultimately what you're doing. It's just trying to go off and make sure whatever abilities you wake up with tomorrow, which may not be the same as they are today, you're going to be able to use the technology around and interact with the world as best as you possibly can. That's not much to add, but it's not how people think. People are very much more geared on what's the sexy new thing. Like at FOSDEM, I gave a talk on accessibility, on sustainability. And I've given talks on both of them, but and I think it may have actually been both an integration of the two. And that one. But the previous two sessions were on AI and they were packed. Like it was like standing room only. And then my talk came up around sustainability. And I mean, the room wasn't empty, but it certainly emptied out. And yet this is one of the things that, like, this is life. This is us. AI is neat and all, but ultimately it's not the thing. But in terms of answering your question, what caused accessibility to go off and actually become a thing that people are paying attention to is the efforts of people with disabilities who have lobbied long and hard and protested, often with civil disobedience, in order to go off and to make sure that their rights are respected, seeing accessibility as a civil right. And so that they are able to go off and have the rights to access by law. And in most Western countries, people with disabilities have rights to work and to employment and to housing and to be able to communicate with their government and whatnot. But that process is not being well respected. The digital world is being very much a move fast and break things kind of world, and actually supporting the bulk of their users is something that generally most companies don't invest in. Even most governments have a far less accessible websites than they say that they should or say that they do. And it's something that it's only through protest and through awareness raising and decades of effort that we've been able to get to where we are right now. And that's something that it's still not where we need to be. We're still not at a point where there's a final site that we can say, yes, this is accessible. This is like, it is, sites are more accessible. There's more awareness, but it's just like security. It's about perpetual vigilance. How do we make sure that we're more accessible today than we were yesterday? And that people are pushing that type of a framework forward. Unfortunately, many people have a checklist mindset. They want to go off and say, has this been done? Yes, done. Let's move on. And that just, unfortunately, doesn't help people with disabilities who are actually experts around their own experience of where they're facing barriers with digital interfaces. And, they need to be able to find ways to engage with their governments or engage with their stores or their friends in ways that are just like everyone else. But that does require effort and maintenance. I
see. Okay. So it sounds like there's a degree of like hard won, essentially campaigning on various levels. And there's
Sadly,
a degree of like
yes.
And there's maybe a degree of actual like organization with the people who are able to say, well, okay, we need to find a way to translate these into concrete things you can ask for, or that people who do want to do the right thing, so they know how to go about doing that.
Right, and, which is how the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and the Web Accessibility Initiative from the WC3 got started, is because they saw that this was a need to try and provide some guidance and direction that everyone could agree on, and that would be a universal point that would allow everyone to agree that this is an improvement that benefits people. And creating standards is a huge challenge, but it's been really important for organizations and governments have been able to lean on those and build legislation around that, some of which actually have teeth for a lot of agencies or organizations around the world. So having legislation that requires accessibility is a huge deal.
I see. And okay, so there's one thing that you just spoke about just there was this idea that, okay, you're essentially able to kind of capture this idea that society values this thing, which is not maybe immediately helping in a quarterly earnings call, for example, but it's still something that people tend to value. And that has ended up being translated into various forms of law. And one of the things that helped with the creation of that law was essentially things like the existence of some of these standards, so that people could then say, well, we want to have, because we value access for everyone rather than just a very specific set of people, we're going to refer to these standards here saying you need to at least hit this kind of bar. That's how
right.
some of it came about. Okay. And if I understand correctly, some of the examples you used earlier on about the situational example, like when you've got a broken arm I think I've seen some of that mentioned from Microsoft actually in some of their inclusive design things. So presumably there's an argument about the regulatory certainty that gets provided then means that organizations themselves might want to invest in saying, well, okay, this is how we are competing in this by, we're going to meet this bar when other people aren't, for example. That's another kind of argument people take. Okay.
And Microsoft has had a great deal of leadership around the thinking around inclusive design and trying to think about how do we make sure that we are thinking about the whole self and not just everyone on their best days.
Okay, cool. So it sounds like there is a bit of a push. So one way that some of these were adopted was essentially going through the public sector route to kind of demonstrate that there's demand and there's something that people need to go for. And by creating that demand, that allowed people to then respond to this. Okay, so are there any like particular countries or examples you've heard of? Because I've heard of like stories like, say, I don't know, the things that started in the public sector, they're then kind of percolated down. So like maybe, I think things with Kindle books, for example, or something like that. Are there any examples we might point to show how something that large organizations might have been prioritizing first, but this ended up kind of shifting them to start prioritizing something in a way that they weren't previously prioritizing?
I think that one of the challenges has been that the governments have initially tried to go off and create their own legislation and not to build on a common standard. And one of the issues of this is that tech is often global. And so if you're trying to go off and create a legislation, like so many governments individually in government agencies just don't have the clout to go off and to go to Microsoft and say, yeah, we want you to go to this and implement these standards because these are this. If you want to sell to us, you have to follow these standards. Like maybe Microsoft will say, sure, well, we'd love to do that. We're happy to go from bend over backwards and make that happen. But most likely they won't. They'll say, sorry, this is what the product is. And if you we'll charge you X amount to go up and have additional costs to go up and to meet those standards. But it's not something that we can cover because you're such a small entity, generally how government procurements work. But if you're able to go off and work on a global standard, then technology, and especially if technology companies are involved, like they have been to the WC3, that there's an opportunity to get them on board and make sure that a lot of the kinks are worked out of the process when it comes to implementation, so that there are things that we know that can be implemented and can be maintained by the technology that we work with, whether that's open source or proprietary. There needs to be an engagement around how we're working on those same set of standards.
So one thing that you've just spoke about there was this notion of, okay, there's some work that goes into creating standards because that allows both organizations at a governmental level to say, hi, we need you to meet at least this bar. But from the other point of view, for people who are trying to meet these standards, let's say, like, okay, you're calling from Europe instead of Canada today, right? So rather than having 28 standards per country in all of Europe, for example, having one makes it a bit easier for someone who's inside the company saying, hey, can we even at least meet this bar? Because this one will mean that we don't need to do it across all these other countries as well, for example. That's one of the ideas around the kind of some of these global standards, yeah?
Absolutely. Having a single standard is much easier to get compliance around, particularly if you get a few larger economies that are adopting it early. Like if the European Union is able to adopt a standard around digital sustainability, that's something that will have real impacts around the rest of the world because a lot of people want to sell their products into Europe. So that's just like the GDPR has had a large impact on privacy outside of Europe as well as inside of Europe because it was something that was agreed to amongst a large enough group of countries that there was an opportunity to really make waves across the digital sector.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. So we were speaking a little bit about accessibility and essentially the same things, because there is maybe not a short-term gain for this. You might talk about it in terms of, okay, you're creating some certainty and saying, well, these are things you need to actually have. And I guess in the context of some recent laws we're seeing passed, you might see some of that start to play out in the form of, I think we have things like, say, the CSRD, the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive in Europe is one example, but even in America, or even in, I think, California specifically, because California is a big enough economy in its own right, you're seeing some regulations there which end up acting as a kind of driver to kind of move to, rather than just have people inside companies saying, we'll save you some money on your green survey. It's like, no, this is the thing that's actually going to be, this is the bar we need to meet if we want to kind of keep selling to these people here, for example, or this is a risk that we can head off by making sure we're compliant with this. That seems to be the argument you're essentially kind of making around that, right?
That's right. And I think that it'll be interesting to see as Scope 3 emissions get more closely monitored and evaluated. The impact of digital, I think, is going to be a lot bigger than it currently is, because most people don't own a data center. They just use services.
Yeah.
So if you're suddenly looking at those people who are managing all of the different technology that we're engaging with our lives on a regular basis, that has a third party impact. And in terms of our Scope 3 emission changes, and I think that it'll be more of a challenge to try and figure out how to regulate those and to address them. The web doesn't really affect most people for their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, but it will certainly affect for Scope 3 emissions.
All right. I'm just going to take a kind of step back out for this. So I just want to check. So when you've mentioned the word Scope 3 and Scope 2 and Scope 1, I assume you're talking about, say, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. This is a bit like a kind of international standard for tracking carbon emissions for an organization, for example. So where Scope 1 might be me burning, say, gas and emissions caused from, I use the hot beverage example because that seems to be a quite easy way to get your head around it. Scope 1 is me burning wood or coal to heat up a kettle so I can have coffee, right? Scope 2 is me consuming electricity. So someone else somewhere is burning coal or gas so I can have coffee. And then Scope 3 is the entire supply chain. So that's like me going into Starbucks so I can have coffee. And then there's still a supply chain, but I'm not burning anything myself. But there is still someone accounting for the emissions that way. And that's what you were talking to when you talk about these kind of Scope 1, 2, and 3 thing here, right?
That's right.
Okay, brilliant. So we spoke a little bit about how there are maybe some patterns, some ideas, and some lessons from the accessibility movement where with the creation of some standards, we've then seen people tie this to say how projects get bought, like how people allocate time and money to do a piece of work. And I think the one thing that when we spoke before, you mentioned about how you saw this happen at a kind of public sector level first, saying we have to make this accessible because we have a mandate to serve all of our population, not just the rich people, basically, or not just like this one target market we've decided to segment and go after, essentially. But that ends up creating a kind of norm which then allows, say, other sectors or kind of more other private sectors to start looking for that as well. And I think there have been examples of, was it the Domino's pizza, for example, the famous example where once people had set a norm that you actually had accessible websites, then was it, maybe you could expand on this one because I think I'm going to get it wrong, but I do remember like Domino's had to start rebuilding their websites and making sure their sites were also accessible to people because the norm had been set.
The US has an unusual piece around accessibility where if your website isn't accessible, you can be sued. There's people who set up lawsuits and some of them are not as legitimate as others. There's easy enough to find accessibility bugs in various different websites, but there are people who are chasing the court system in order to try and get revenue from lawsuits. So then that happens quite a lot in the state. And that's a huge motivator around accessibility in the world, actually, is this fear of lawsuits from or within the United States. But Domino's got sued and they were like, we're not going to pay for this. We're just going to go off and challenge this in the courts. We don't think this is necessary. They did end up losing the case, and they also spent quite a lot more in legal fees than they did in actually hiring web developers who knew what they were doing and actually were able to fix the issue. But it was an interesting case in that they just the egos of the senior management at Domino's were like, well, we don't believe this is the right way to do it, so we're just going to do it our way. Even though they were explicitly excluding customers who were trying to go up and buy their services.
Like, hey, I want a pizza. And they're like,
yeah,
no,
I want a pizza. Like,
yeah.
So I was like, why couldn't a blind person order a pizza through Domino's Pizza online ordering system? It seems ridiculous. They wouldn't want to go off and to address their customers. But that is the case for some companies. And having a hammer or to go off and to come down and for those organizations who are opposing best practices is sometimes needed. Unfortunately, you need to have the carrots and the sticks.
Okay, so one thing you've said, there was basically an immediate harm that was being felt by some groups who were able to then look to some specific laws and say, hey, that was essentially the basis for that. And that's how you've been able to kind of maybe compel some activity from organizations who might not be prioritizing otherwise, right?
Yeah.
Now, for that to be possible, presumably you needed to be able to demonstrate that a website was unusable, for example, or something wasn't working the way it would. I mean, are there any lessons that we might apply from how we think about maybe normalizing some things around digital sustainability for this? Like, is there anything we can use from there? Because it sounds like I don't think anyone's been sued for not having a green website or not,
No.
or a green digital service or anything like that. And I'm not saying you should reach for that first, but that's clearly one of the techniques that people have been using in other fields to kind of compel action.
It is interesting though that you're suggesting now that you can't claim to have a green product if you don't, they're making greenwashing illegal, which is, it's similar in some ways, but so much around accessibility is being around the creation of these web content accessibility guidelines, which have been a set of best practices that have been created by people around the world. Very much like in the sustainability field, the web sustainability guidelines are much newer and they're only being developed by a committee. So they're not something that is a full WC3 working group recommendation, but it's something that is moving in that direction. But I think that in terms of motivating people, you need to have some bar that you can say, how do you demonstrate what the expectations are and that you're meeting those expectations and have a common bar to from and to compare yourself against? Because how many people have a website that is green enough? There are not that many. And even when you're looking at trying to create the standards and look at, well, how large should a web page be? There's a lot of different views. And the average weight of a web page, we know right now is about, I think it's 4 megabytes is the average weight of a web page.
Bigger than Doom, then,
yeah.
So
it's only the initial release of Doom after all. So but it's still shocking that it's that as large as it is. And there's so much cruft that is not necessary. But do you think we can get a website down so that the average site is 100 kilobytes? Well, maybe, but it's going to be a huge amount of effort to go off and remove all that cruft and advertising and layers of JavaScript and to weed out what is actually necessary to convey. And then there's also elements of how do we build society that is where there's privacy exploiting JavaScript apps that are adding to the bloat of the infrastructure, that we're not addressing security issues. Because again, if you've got a lot of software, you probably haven't monitored it to make sure that it is meeting best practices. And having secure, sustainable code is really a huge part of just creating quality code. If you just redefine it as part of quality, then that's something that is, I think, really an important way to reframe the advantages of building for accessibility and sustainability.
So thanks for that. So there's a couple of things that we spoke about, and I realize I'm showing my age. I'm making a joke about Doom, and I realize that most people, for them to get Doom, they need to know what a floppy disk drive is. And you realize, oh my word, I realize that ages me quite a lot. So for anyone who, Doom was a very popular 3D shooter, and it's definitely smaller than most websites these days. Okay, all right, let's move away from that somewhat depressing note and try and get back to what we were talking about. So you're talking about there was essentially a way of demonstrating that there's some expectations that you have, and then you're able to demonstrate if a website was meeting a certain bar of accessibility. And I think when I've heard people talk about accessibility, they use this term POUR, is it perceivable, operable,
understandable, and robust?
Yeah.
Robust is a tricky one, but that's basically trying to go up and make sure that you're doing this in a real world environment. That is something that is not just set up in a lab, but you've actually got real people, real engagements, real user flows.
I see. And so perceivable was okay, if you're not blind, you can't see, obviously, so you should be able to perceive something. Operable, I get the idea that you can operate it, right?
Yeah.
Understandable, self-explanatory, and
plain language, all that stuff.
Yeah. And then the robust thing is basically this idea that, okay, you've opened this discussion about saying in certain parts of remote Canada, you can't access something, for example. That's robust, something might degrade gracefully, so you can still achieve a particular thing, even if you don't have the latest, greatest iPhone on the super fast Wi-Fi or something like that, right?
Right, exactly. It's looking at what are people using, how are people engaging with your site, and how do you try and address those. And there's not as many success criteria for robustness because it is a trickier one. Perception is certainly one of the easier ones to address, and that's mostly about trying to go up and have textual equivalents for non-textual content and making sure that the information is visible for people when, however they're able to, with whatever senses that they have, that they're able to perceive that.
I see. Okay. So one thing that I guess that one insight I'm taking away from that is that these don't necessarily have to be like a binary yes, no thing every single time. Obviously it helps and it means you can automate things, but that's not an absolute deal breaker for creating a set of guidelines, for example, or something that you might write into a commercial agreement, or might say that, every public website should at least be doing this kind of stuff. It sounds like you don't necessarily need to have that kind of binary thing.
One of the things that they've tried to, the courts definitely want it to be binary, and there's definitely things that are, there's different levels of WCAG. There's level A, AA, and AAA.
Oh, sorry, you said WCAG. Is that WCAG? This is Web Content...
Web Content Accessibility Guidelines.
Got it.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
Okay.
Some people just pronounce it WCAG, but I've gone with WCAG.
WCAG, yeah.
Somehow rolls off the tongue faster than, or easier than WCAG.
Okay, right.
The WC3 in general is good at many things, but not naming things. But the point of the level A, AA, and AAA is it's trying to say, what are the bare minimum things that things people should do? Easiest stuff that affects the most people. What is sort of AA is what is legally required. So in most countries, it's WCAG 2.0 AA is the legal requirement. And AAA is sort of aspirational stuff. So knowing that your users are this base. If you're dealing with senior citizens, for example, you might want to go above and beyond what WCAG 2.0 AA provides, because you know that your users are going to have less perception of color. So you want to have higher contrast available for them than you might for other users. So it's really about stretch goals so it's an interesting approach to structure content so that you're hopefully trying to go off and encourage the organizations to push themselves to better understand their users and be able to build a website that meets the needs of their users.
I see. Okay. So if maybe one thing I'm taking away from that is that, first of all, okay, there's value in binary, but there's also value in certain kind of grades, as it were. And that might be more useful for the specific, set of audiences you're trying to reach or who you're trying to cater, for example.
Right.
And presumably this, by kind of breaking into something like this, kind of removes some of the need to be an absolute domain expert, so that if you're commissioning some work, you can say, well, you need to be meeting AA, for example, for this.
Right.
And that's what you could write into, say, a procurement thing to make sure it definitely does happen inside a new project, for example.
Yeah. And that's what a lot of organizations have tried to do, is they've tried to go off and put in contracting language that their product or service must be WCAG 2.2 AA compliant. Mm-hmm. That's what the current best practice would be. But unfortunately, procurement officers often drop off the necessities. If the client says that the site is accessible, they'll leave it at that, and that there'll be not necessarily any follow-up. And if the project manager on the client side doesn't care or isn't motivated to address this or doesn't have a subject matter expert that they can evaluate, then it's something that can be quite difficult to implement. And especially since, like so many things, if you don't think about it early enough in the process,
it's easy to get,
Yeah. So so often accessibility has been left to the end. And then, the budget's spent, the time has run out, and now you've got these accessibility issues you've just now discovered. Well, guess what? They're not going to happen, right? They're going to be, or they're going to be done badly and in a way that's more expensive because it's being done after the fact. And that's often a more fragile way to go off and implement technologies. Think about it from the beginning.
I see. Okay. So there's two things that come out of that I think are possibly worth exploring in a bit more detail. One of these was this idea that basically the cost of checking if something is still working the way it's supposed to, like, people saying, oh, it's totally accessible, but being able to check if something really is accessible. This is one thing that I think you've pointed me to some work with. There's some software like Purple Alley. Yeah. Purple Alley. Yeah. I'm not sure where the Alley thing came from, but for people who are not familiar with the lingo, Alley is A11Y, which is the number of letters for accessibility. And Mike, you introduced me. What was the name of?
It's a numerum. Anytime you go off, you take the letters at the beginning and the end, and you squish them together. Like internationalization is I18N, localization is I10N. It's just you squish them together and create a number.
I see. And that would explain the whole S12Y that I think people keep trying to make happen with sustainability in the kind of digital world, right?
Yes.
Yeah. It feels a little bit Mean Girl saying, stop trying to make fetch happen, right? But this is something that I struggle with as well. And if for people who are curious why this episode is called A11Y to S12Y, now you know why. It's numerums at work, basically. Okay.
And they make a lot of sense, especially in Twitter, they make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
But now that we no longer are limited by 180 characters,
yeah.
it actually in some ways just complicates things, because since sustainable development has been a term popularized by the Brundtland Commission in I guess it was the 80s, the sustainability is being overused and generalized in a way that makes it very difficult to understand things, and just sort of shortening it into S12Y doesn't actually make it more understandable or any more specific. It's just made it more,
Just
added another
and slightly
fewer
more
characters
obscure.
and more confusion. So it is something that does happen.
It does make for a cool hashtag though. So I suppose, swings and roundabouts. All right. So we digressed. And the reason we mentioned Purple Alley or A11Y was because I think this was something you were telling me about, how there are increasingly tools which, rather than just doing a one-off check at the end of a project, might continuously be tracking some of this. And this is maybe a way to kind of almost provide like continuous audit or something as one of the mechanisms that you might use to kind of maintain a level of quality, for example. I believe Wagtail was one example. They built some tools. So when you're editing a web page, they will basically give you a kind of check ahead of time. So it's a bit like shift left, but for content editors or people who do this. So before you publish something, you'll see some of this. And I would assume that other content management systems have these kinds of checks as part of the kind of workflow process, rather than it being a thing that gets checked once a year, for example.
Right. Drupal has it for the code level. We don't have it for the content level. There are plugins you can add in or modules you can add in for Drupal that give the authors that sort of context, but we don't have it built into core. And that's something, so it's an effort to go in and install that. Hopefully it's something that will come into core at some point, but that's a much bigger discussion around how and what tool to use and how that would be implemented. But Purple Alley is a great tool for scanning websites and providing an understanding of where accessibility issues are across hundreds, if not thousands of pages, because there's a lot of tools that are built into your browser that you can use to scan a single page. So like there's websitecarbon.com and the EcoGrader which are great tools, but they will evaluate one page, and you can pay for services, certainly from EcoGrader, that will go off and allow you to scan your site.
Mm-hmm.
They keep a sense of your site. But most people are not necessarily going to do that, and not everything is designed for that. And site scanning tools, it's nice to be able to have an open source solution that is able to give you a sense of the challenges and the barriers that you're running into as you're developing the site. And you can see that you're making progress, or your site is more accessible today than it was yesterday. And incorporation of something like CO2.js into that would be a really great addition. And there's other tools that could be useful to go off and to aggregate quality as well, and get a sense of like plain language as something that's very difficult for people to go off and write. People think they understand it, but it actually takes a whole lot of work to go off and write in plain language. But this type of language complexity can be evaluated on a code level, at least on the English language. It's more difficult for other languages, but the more we can sort of build in testing early in the process. However, when a site's being developed, it was built on a weekly or 2-week sprint cycle. The team, when they're doing their sprint planning, should know what their accessibility issues are this week and compared to the last sprint. So they can say that if they're actually making it more accessible today than it was previously. And the same thing should be applying for sustainability, because there's things that do change in code, like a new JavaScript library is added and things slow down, or there's an image that somebody added and that's something that is not noticed by the development team. And you want to catch that as early as possible, partly because it's easier to fix them because you've just added it. So you should be able to
it's clear in your mind,
find the issue and you're like, oh, it's just the last sprint. We approved that, and you can learn from that process. I think of much like spell checkers. Like if spell checking was something that you only did right before you submitted your paper, like you're not going to learn. You're going to be frustrated by the process. It'll be something you ship off to somebody else to deal with, and you're not going to go off and build that into your own practice. But if you see the errors and you see them as you're writing it, eventually you will write better, and you'll have a sense of what are the mistakes you often get and how do you try and avoid them going ahead.
I see. Okay. So it's basically a piece of like incorporating into like your workflow, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
You said one other thing that I wanted to unpack, if I may, which was a little bit about setting expectations, like talking a little bit about how, because you mentioned there's things you can do for like language, for example. And we spoke a little bit about this idea that, okay, there's a certain level. I think you mentioned WCAG AA or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I know that one example I've seen from other places is saying, we aim to meet this level, and this is how we check for this, and here's how to actually contact us for any kind of breaches, for example. Like these seems to be mechanisms that I can see being adopted to talk about digital sustainability. Like one of the reasons I was particularly interested about Purple Alley, and that one there is it's an open source tool, so anyone can use it for free, assuming they have access to like a computer to do that. But also the Singapore government have been talking about using this to check their own digital estate as well. And that's how I know that in the public sector, some people are using these to do some of this kind of continuous monitoring, or at least some way to kind of flag things up to make some of this a bit more kind of observable and actionable, I suppose. And like, as far as I'm aware, we don't really have any way of, do we have a way of checking that for accessibility? When you go to a website or a digital service, you say, well, is there a way of seeing a kind of consistent URL like .wellknown/A11Y or something to see where they say what they are, say what level they're trying to reach, and then how to kind of test about this? Because this feels like something you could, at least for certain things, be able to kind of verify the claims that you're making, basically.
Right. I mean, I think right now for accessibility, the best practice is around trying to create an accessibility statement that's in the footer of a web page. So if you go to any European government website now, you'll see a page that is about accessibility that gives you information. And if it's properly structured, it'll say, it'll have a feedback form that allows you to go up and give feedback if you run into a barrier. It'll tell you what they've done and how they've done it, and get a sense of what some of those challenges are. Also, it's useful to highlight what are the processes that they've done to go off and to assess accessibility. All of that can be built into an accessibility statement. And the same type of thing could very much be included in a sustainability statement. And there are going to be pages. There's going to be outliers.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, there's no reason that couldn't be done in the same way. And you just have a little link in the footer that explains what the process is. And you evaluate that page on an annual basis to make sure that there aren't things that are being forgotten. So that if you're changing your processes, which they do, you come back and reflect on that and say, well, how do we make this better this year than it was the last? That reflection, I think, is an important part of it, as well as the feedback loop with your users.
Okay, all right. So there is a way. So maybe this is actually quite a nice segue for us to move from. Okay, so that's one pattern that we've seen adopted in the accessibility field, where we know there's a tradition of being quite specific about things you're looking to purchase, but also some ways of checking that people are actually like meeting the things that they're saying they're doing. I mean, there are some parallels to the whole kind of green claims discussion, I suppose, and that you might see online where people are saying, you can't mark this product as carbon neutral by buying offsets anymore. But they say, like, if you're going to make any kind of claim, you need to kind of substantiate these claims now, rather than actually just having some woolly language around this. So, okay. And maybe this is a nice way to talk a little bit about like what that might look like for digital sustainability, because I believe I know there's these digital sustainability guidelines. i.e. WSGs. I'm not quite sure what we would call them. I mean, in Germany, you might call them like VSG, as a bit like a joke on ESG. Ignore it. Like, we don't have a good word for them. I mean, nothing as snappy as WCAG yet. So We'll come up with something for those. I do know that there has been some work to make some of these checkable. I remember the name, it was STAR, wasn't it? STAR, which is
That's right.
Sustainability, Technology, Accessibility, something. Do you know the thing I'm referring to here? Yeah,
I do, but I don't have the acronyms.
Sustainable Tooling and Reporting. This is what it was, actually. Yeah, I just looked it up in a tab. Yeah.
There's a whole lot of effort to go off and get a pronounceable acronym that is also somewhat meaningful and doesn't offend anyone. And that's what we came up with as STAR, because it's a generally universally appreciated type of thing. So
okay, well, this is good, and this is like machine readable things that you could check. So you could check it each year, but you could almost
And the more that I think that there's always going to be things that are going to be, there's some things you can check by machine, but you're not going to be able to check it all by machine. Like even with WCAG, that's been around for as long as it has, you can only catch about a third of the issues using automated checkers. So with sustainability, there's going to need to be manual oversights, but there's stuff that you can check. Like knowing where the site is hosted and where the third-party libraries are hosted. Like that's stuff that's checkable because it's just an IP address.
Look up,
check against a database and determine whether it's there. And the same with the size of the pages and the use of JavaScript. These are all things that can be evaluated in a very black and white sort of manner, and compared year after year to see how are you dealing with sprint after sprint to make sure that you're actually making movements on this. And just to make for people to realize that these tools are things that have been hidden, like the weight of a page has been hidden for people for so long. They're becoming much easier to go up and evaluate and to track and to identify. So a lot of the stuff is going to be more noticeable for people and for them to say, well, why is my page taking so long to load? Who's responsible for that? Like that is going to be an issue that the people will start to pay more attention to because they have to, because there will be legislation, hopefully, that requires an organization to demonstrate that they are improving their performance and have improved customer experience and making a more sustainable site.
Okay. So I'm speaking to you because you're in France, and I know that if we're talking about digital sustainability, France is currently one of the countries which is kind of at the forefront, and I'm going to butcher the RG. I can't remember what the specific, and it's basically the French version of digital sustainability. I think it's Référentiel Général des Conceptions des Services Numériques, but basically it's the equivalent to digital sustainability stuff. It looks a little bit like the digital sustainability kind of guidelines, but the French version that they've been written and there's, as far as I'm aware, this is something which has been adopted nationally as a thing that you would actually include. Now, there's another discussion about how you might kind of maintain that and enforce that and make sure and what the remedy mechanisms are if you are in breach of that. But like that's one of the examples that I guess, that's one thing that people might be looking at as an example of, okay, here's some ideas here's what some of this might look like, for example.
Yeah. No, I think it's great. And there's things that I think would have been quite useful to have done for accessibility as well. For example, engineers are required to take a course on sustainability when they're getting educated in universities. Well, why isn't that part of how things are done in accessibility as well? That's a big one. There's certainly a lot of elements around evaluating municipalities and evaluating other government agencies in terms of what their digital sustainability plans are. A lot of work around recycling electronics. Again, that's a big part of this puzzle, is trying to make sure that all of the carbon and resources and energy that goes into these devices is managed as effectively as possible. So again, that's really forward-thinking stuff. And also, it's wonderful that France has gone first on this and highlight that this is something that like somebody has to go first. Somebody has to demonstrate that it's a possibility. And France has legislation in place long before people are even thinking about it. So it's been a real good thing for the Web Sustainability Guidelines to be able to look at and learn from what's being done in France and to say, well, how do we take this model that is being successfully implemented in France and try and say, well, how do we scale this up to the rest of the world?
I see. So like you said before about, okay, are there lessons you can make more general? We should probably give a shout out to the fact that, and one of the reasons I know about this is some work from Gauthier Rossille, and also I think Thibaut Collas was one of the people who basically draw attention to basically a translated version of the old RGSN as examples of this. And when I first read them, I was like, wow, this is actually quite well written, and it kind of stays in its lane in the sense that it's just focusing on digital sustainability. It might refer to some other things, but it's not repeating too much of the other guidance that exists in other forms with other groups and other working groups. Okay, cool.
Also, a shout out to Laurent de Vennery, who's also I'll include a link to an article I wrote for Apolitical talking about the French legislation and trying to help make it more accessible to the English-speaking world, because I think that's something that's often a barrier for good ideas is language and culture. And so trying to encourage a broader adoption and understanding of what countries are doing effectively to make these changes.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we're just starting to come to time, but it sounds like there are a few things we could learn from the world of accessibility. Like, it's not perfect, but yeah, the idea of like setting some basic standards that you can then write into procurement is one thing that we've got. Like, we don't really have the equivalent to poor, like perceivable, operable, robust yet. I wish we had that for digital sustainability, and maybe one day we will. But that seems to be a thing that will be helpful. But the whole notion of being able to like continuously check to see if something is, or at least have a way of checking if people are saying something and then are they able to kind of deliver against that. There's a precedent in accessibility that may also be relevant for sustainability too. And we have a growing number of standards from outside of technology that we might even be able to refer to for the things outside of how a website is built that might actually speak to some of the kind of other wider sustainability considerations as well, by the sounds of things.
Absolutely. And I think that the more we can learn from other people's work, the better it is. It's not like we're anywhere where we need to be around accessibility, but there's been some advances around accessibility that are useful to learn from. With sustainability, we just don't have the 2 decades or 3 decades of struggle to get us where we need to be. We need to have countries very quickly taking on regulations that allow us to quickly start scaling down the technology. Because Because so many organizations buy technology that is there for at least a few years, if not for a decade. And large organizations are buying technology that is going to be in place for a long time. It takes a long time to shift from one stack to another. So we need to be prioritizing sustainability in the procurement process as early as possible, so that is something that can be built in as we go ahead and as we're building towards a more sustainable future.
Brilliant. Well, Mike, thank you very much for sharing your perspective and your experience with us today. If people are curious about what you've been discussing or some of the work you're doing right now, where should people be looking? Where would you direct people's attention to if they wanted to learn more?
Right now, the best place to go and find me is on LinkedIn, and it's Mike Gifford is the easiest way to access me. I'm also on a bunch of different Slack channels like the Drupal Slack or the Climate Action Tech Slack. So that's another way to reach out. I do have other social media accounts like Mastodon and Twitter, but I generally don't use them as much as I do LinkedIn.
Okay, all right. And Civic Actions?
Yes.
That's civicactions.com, presumably. And
that's right.
If there's any of the other kind of user groups or working groups you're part of, are there anyone's we should be thinking about? Like is it Open Web? I forget the name of them now, actually. You said there's another CMS group.
The Open Web Alliance that's coming together. That's an effort to try and get different content management systems to be able to support and work together to go off and build a more effective open web. So that's one group. Also, the Susty Web community group is definitely something to consider joining if you're interested in sustainability. And there's an effort to turn that into a full working group, which will require more effort and leadership for people to be involved. So yeah, those are definitely some of the main places to see. On accessibility, you can also find us on our accessibility subsite, which is accessibility.civicactions.com.
Brilliant. Okay. And I just realized you mentioned something about FOSDEM in a talk. I'll share the link to the FOSDEM Sustainability and Accessibility talk, which was what prompted some of these discussions in the first place. This has been fun, and I didn't realize that you were in Europe. So if I ever do pass through Paris or pass through Carcassonne or France, maybe we'll get a glass of wine or something.
Right? That would be lovely.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mike. Lovely to chat to you again. All right. Take care.
See you, Chris.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.